Elizabeth Laird is an award-winning children's author, with her books having been translated into at least 15 languages. She has travelled extensively across the Middle East, Asia and Africa, providing her with a wealth of inspiration for her books, and she is well known for the large body of folk tales collected from the regions of Ethiopia. Her latest title, A House Without Walls, is a powerful story of family, hope and redemption, set amidst the refugee crisis in Syria. And Elizabeth talked more to Nikki Gamble about her work and travels.
Before we talk about your new book, I wanted to set a little bit of context. I'm thinking about our listeners who are mainly teachers and librarians. And this novel, like some of your previous work, is set in the Middle East. I thought it would be useful to go back and think about your connections with this area, because it's not something you've just started writing about now. It has a history to it. I'm thinking about my own recollections, back in the late 1960s, I think it was, I was a member of a brownie group, as many girls were in those days, and the two leaders of that pack ran a group at our local church on a Friday called the Friends of Lebanon.
Oh, yes.
I didn't really know what they did, other than that I sewed soft toys and they were sold at Christmas, and that it was to support children in Lebanon. What I didn't really know was that was a period when troubles were really brewing in that particular country. And you know something about that, because I understand you were living there at that time. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yes. Perhaps I'll go back a little bit before Lebanon, because when I first got married, my main focus before I was married was actually Ethiopia, where I'd lived for some time and got to know very well. But when I got married, my husband and I started our married life in Baghdad, in Iraq. And this was when Saddam Hussein was just coming to power. And we were able to travel around the country, up to Kurdistan and down to the marshes and into the desert. And that was a very, very interesting time, and I got to know that country a little bit. And then we were transferred back to London, and David decided to work for the United Nations. And at that time, there was a really awful civil war going on in Lebanon. It was civil war is the cruelest of all wars, because people are fighting members of their family and their next door neighbours, and cities are torn apart. Anyway, off we went. By this time we had a baby, Angus, and we went to live in Beirut. Well, that was quite exciting. When we arrived, we stayed in a flat lent to us by a friend, which was on the Green Line, which is the line which divides the two warring parts of the city. So it had been shot up rather a lot, and there were bullet marks all the way down the wardrobes, and lots of broken glass. And my poor baby was 6 months old. I couldn't let him out of his suitcase. He sat in the suitcase, a sort of makeshift playpen.
Oh, wow.
It was very good, I must say. Eventually we got our own flat, and we stayed there for 9 months while the fighting got worse and worse. Sometimes we'd go out onto the balcony in the evenings and we would watch the fighting, because you could see the mortars going up from one part of the town, and the light across the sky, and then you'd see it land and the flash, and then a few seconds later you'd hear the bang, and then you'd see answering mortars coming over, and they just went across us, but occasionally one went straight and it seemed to come right for us. At that point we grabbed the baby and dived under the kitchen table.
Yeah.
So it was quite scary. And then we were evacuated by the UN, and that was dramatic. I was on the last plane out of Lebanon to Vienna, where we then lived for another year. The United Nations transferred us to Vienna.
It's a part of the world that perhaps many people don't have as detailed a knowledge as they might.
Not, yes.
And the part of the world that we're looking at is that kind of northwest corner of what's called the Middle East.
Yes.
And the countries that we have in that area. So there's Turkey, and then just to the south, Kurdistan.
So Turkey abuts Syria, and Lebanon, which was once part of Syria, is a kind of tuck-in off Syria. And then below that, Lebanon runs into Israel, and then Israel in the south runs into Egypt, and then you go around the corner and you hit North Africa. And then if you go inland from Lebanon, you get to Jordan, which is a desert country, and then you cross into Jordan, and then you're in Iraq.
Yeah.
And the south of Iraq, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the two great rivers, go south through Iraq until they get to the Gulf, and then they enter the Gulf waters down there in the south. And then you've got all that stuff, with Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and all that. But that's the Gulf.
But that's quite different on that eastern side.
Yes, that's quite different.
And if we were to look on the map, which would be a good thing to do with
very
children.
Good thing to do, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
It's surprising how close this is to Cyprus and to Europe.
Yeah. And in fact, Lebanon, which has a long connection with France, is very French, I mean, people speak French, and they think of Paris as home, and they lead a French, they eat lovely French food, and they're extremely French, a lot of the Lebanese are. So it's a very mixed, interesting, I love Beirut. It's such a gorgeous... I was last there in September last year, and I just love it.
Fantastic.
Yes, it's wonderful.
An area that we know for great troubles, but those troubles are relatively recent in that area, aren't they? When I say relatively recent, I'm talking about 100 years, and the post-First World War, which had a great impact on that region. I think we sometimes forget the impact that treaties at the end of that war created in other parts of the world, and the Middle East is one that's really suffered from that.
Very true, Nikki. And the great powers, in other words, France, definitely Britain, United States and Russia, have behaved atrociously in the Middle East. They've used it as a cockpit for their own interests, and the result is a dreadful mess, and it's still the case.
And so we are going to come to the stories, because this is about how this big canvas affects the lives of ordinary people.
Exactly.
And that's where we get to when we think about your novels.
That's right.
If you can bear with me just for a little moment longer before we get to your latest novel, I'd just like to think about some of the others that you've written set in this landscape. Kiss the Dust. This is about Kurdistan, isn't it? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Kiss the Dust is about the Kurdish people of Kurdistan, which is top right-hand corner of Iraq, if you like. And they're mountain people, so there's a range of mountains that runs between Iraq and Iran, and that's where the Kurds live. And some of them are in Iran, some of them in Iraq, and some of them are in Turkey in the north. And they had a very tough time under Saddam Hussein. And I watched, when I was there, the Kurdish trucks coming down out of the mountains, full of women and children being taken out of the villages forcibly by Saddam Hussein. And my interest was sparked then. And when we got back to London, I thought, well, I must write about this. Must bear witness. So I wrote a novel called Kiss the Dust, which is still in print.
It is.
It's been in print for 30 years.
Yes.
And it takes a family through their life in a Kurdish family, and how they have to flee to Iran, and then they seek asylum in Britain, and what it's like when they get here. And I'm very sorry to say that it's still very relevant today.
We can see this trajectory going through your novels, and the revisiting in different countries, the same context in a way, the same situation.
Yes.
A Little Piece of Ground. So this is...
yes. Now that one, I was invited to go and work with Palestinian authors who were trying to write children's books in Gaza and in the West Bank. So I thought, oh yeah, I'll go and do that. So I went off to first the West Bank and did a course with them, and then Gaza. But unfortunately, what they call the Intifada was on at the time, and the curfew kept coming down. So, you'd be stuck. Suddenly, there'd be blaring loudspeakers, and you all had to get locked down into your house. You couldn't move, and it was quite dangerous, actually. If you went out of your house, you could get shot. So anyway, I was really terribly upset by what I saw happening to the Palestinians. And I met a wonderful Palestinian writer called Sonia Nimmer.
Yes, I know.
And we collaborated. And so I went back a few months later to Palestine, to Ramallah, and stayed with her and her delightful family. And we cooked up the plot together, and then I went away and wrote it. So A Little Piece of Ground is about 3 boys. One is a refugee, an internal refugee in Palestine. One is a boy from Ramallah, and the other is, well, they're both from Ramallah. The other is, one's Muslim and one's Christian, because of course there are many Christian Palestinians too. And all they want to do is find a place to play football, which is a metaphor, of course, for the whole of Palestine.
Yes. And we come to the two most recent, which are about this latest conflict, although there are other conflicts.
Well,
that
there's
are
Oranges
starting...
in No Man's Land, which is about
yes,
the war
of
in
course.
Beirut.
Yes. Did that come first, though?
It did, actually.
Yeah.
It came before Little Piece of Ground, I think. I can't remember.
Yeah.
All about the same time. And for that story, David and I, in a lull in the fighting, had been invited to lunch on the other side of the Green Line. So off we went, with the baby back in the car, you know. And when we got back in the evening, everything had been quiet. The city was quiet and calm, and we thought, this is fine. But as we got near the Green Line, David, who had been in the army, said, "Oh, we've got a problem." He said, "Something's about to kick off. Hang on to the baby." And he put his foot down, and we screamed across the Green Line. And I looked up where there's a big square where in the morning all the traders had been out selling their fruit and veg and their, you know, socks and shoes. And obviously a panic had just set in because the traders had all run away, leaving their stuff out in the open. And somebody had tipped over a fruit stall, and the oranges were rolling down the street. And the snipers were in place on the rooftops. And actually we got on the other side, and the crack fire. And then a few 100 yards further on, it was all quiet and peaceful. We got the baby home, put him out his bath, and put him to bed. But that was it was a very frightening moment.
I was going to say, you must have been terrified.
I was
You talk about it now with
I was
all confidence.
I was really scared. That was really... So I wrote Oranges in No Man's Land, remembering that incident.
And now we come to our two most recent novels.
Yes.
Welcome to Nowhere, which won the UKLA Book Award.
It did. Thank you very much, teachers. I'm so grateful for that.
And A House Without Walls, which is what we're going to talk about today. So A House Without Walls is about a family who have to leave Syria. Father's a lawyer. He's fallen on the wrong side of the authorities and has to leave. And they settle with family in Jordan. So tell us a little bit to begin with about where this story came from.
Yes. Well, I've been in Munich on holiday, and I'd seen the refugees arriving in Germany, these exhausted people, you know, who got across the Mediterranean somehow and got themselves to Germany, coming off the trains, and I was deeply moved. I thought, this is one of the great stories of our time, and I must bear witness to it. So I went home, tried to write about it, but I couldn't because I hadn't done the journey. So I thought, well, I better go to the source. I better go and find out what's going on in the Middle East. So I had a young friend who was working in refugee camps in Jordan, and I phoned her up and said, come on, get me in there. So she said, okay, you can do some training for teachers in the refugee camps. So I went off to Jordan, and I spent some time in two of the camps in northern Jordan, teaching with Syrian teachers, all refugees who were working in the schools in the camps. And on that the basis of that I wrote Welcome to Nowhere. But only 20% of the refugees live in camps. All the others are stuck outside, you know, in tents, in shacks, making do, begging, selling matches, you know, getting poorly paid jobs. And also the people who suffer most are the ones who've left a very good life behind them. People who've had nice big TVs and comfortable leather sofas and lovely showers and bathrooms and comfortable jobs and the children at good schools. They're the ones who really crash and get depressed and can't cope. So I thought, well, I must try and tackle that particular kind of family. And so I decided to write that novel as well. I went back to Jordan to research that one and then set to write the novel.
I think what's interesting, well, there are quite a few things that I wanted to pick up about the kind of family they are. The main character is a girl called Safia, and she's very resourceful and resilient, in fact. She has a twin as well, but the twin doesn't live with them. She's been taken away by an uncle. Tell me a little bit about where the idea for twins came from, because I thought it was such a good idea of contrasting without being too obvious.
Thank you. Well, it came partly because I have twin nephews. They're in their 50s now, but you know, I've always been fascinated by their very close relationship. And I know that if one had been taken away at birth, like Safia and Sabah were separated, the other one would have had this feeling that they weren't quite complete. as often happens with twins. But also, I had a little brother, and he died when he was 3. My first novel was about him, Red Sky in the Morning, actually. So there's always been this hole in my own life, a sort of Alistair-shaped kind of hole in my life. And it's always been this feeling of loss. And somehow I wanted to explore that. But the other thing I wanted to do was to contrast the life of this amazing girl, Safia, has to do so much, and she has to be so brave, as you say, resourceful. But her twin is a privileged American teenager who doesn't even realise that she's a twin. So when the two finally come together, there's a dreadful shock on both sides. And I think my readers, they will be in the position of the American teenager, British teenager actually, who lives a comfortable life, who has everything, good school experience and loving parents and nice trainers, and they will suddenly see this other girl through the eyes of the twin in the story. That was like what the kind of shock I wanted to create there.
Yeah. I was interested that you chose the first person for your narrator, and I wondered whether it was because it's easier to write because you can hear her voice, or whether you thought it would be easier for a reader to relate to her.
It's such a funny business, this first person thing, It's just horses for courses. I mean, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I've written a few novels where the focus jumps between characters, like Crusade, where there are 2 characters. It's a historical novel. The Christian dog boy of a knight, English knight, and the Saracen boy, who is the servant of a doctor in Palestine. And so, of course, I had to have the third person because I had to be in both their heads. But somehow I find you get nearer to the raw emotions if you are in the first person, really. Not always, but, I know this is a dreadful thing to say, but I don't think I've succeeded unless my readers cry. And I don't mean in a bad way. I mean, I want them to feel a strong emotion. And that's what I'm trying to make them feel. It's like the old definition of catharsis in tragedy. You purge the emotions through pity and fear. And so that afterwards, when you've had a good emotional response to a book, you feel somehow stronger and better. And that's what I think a good book should do to kids.
That's interesting, because I think you did something with this book which is so much more than making us feel pity for this character. Actually, we admire her.
Respect.
And
that's the thing.
I felt that it would have been easy to make me pity her and the things that she was going through, but actually I was rooting for her. I thought she was a brilliant, brave girl. That's why I enjoyed it so much, I think.
Thank you, Nikki. No, that's what I wanted to do, was to, it's a dreadfully shocking and sad thing that asylum seeker and refugee has become a term of abuse, and it's used as such in schools. Any kid, Muslim kid, any kind of kid, is now bullied and teased very often. And yet, what have they been through? My God, we should be praising and respecting them for what they've been through. And, one of the things I hope with these 2 particular novels, with all my novels actually, is that they will help a child to look at the kid in the next seat at school who may have come from Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Yemen, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, and think, wow, what have you done? How did you get here? What's your story? You must be so brave.
You're very kind as a writer, I think. You are kind to your characters, even the ones that display traits that are less than pleasant. You find redeeming things very often in those characters. I wanted to think for a moment about Safia's father, who has been this successful lawyer in Syria and really does find it very hard coming to terms, as you've said. And he's not terribly practical. Practical's a word that's mentioned quite a few times in the book. And you seem to admire that practicality that other characters have.
Poor Baba, I feel so sorry for him. I mean, he was a hotshot lawyer in Damascus. He'd never had to, wash a sock or put a screw in a wall. I didn't know how to do anything except be a hotshot lawyer. And people like him are suffering double whammies in the refugee situation. First of all, they've lost their job. Secondly, they've lost their status. Thirdly, they've lost their economic power. Fourthly, they feel that they've lost the respect of their children. They feel powerless. They easily suffer from depression. It puts dreadful strain on marriages. And, they can't fulfill the role of father as they see it. And they're having a really difficult time. But they have to maintain their dignity, their sense of worth. I felt terribly sorry for Baba in the story.
And although it seems so distant to us in many ways, who can say these things could happen anywhere to anyone?
Oh, yes.
And I wonder whether we bring up our young, our children, to be practical. I sometimes think that about my own son. Have I really taught him to be a practical person? How would he cope in really difficult circumstances?
I know, Nikki, and I do think actually that we owe it to our children to give them all a copy of the SES Survival Handbook and teach them how to light a fire, cook something, do things in the house. I mean, not necessarily skin a rabbit, but I mean, have a sense of, if you can't do it at home, and I have to say I wasn't terribly good with my own kids, if you can't do it at home, then I think if you can send them on some kind of outward bound or survival experience, their confidence will surge, they'll get a feeling of self-worth. And I think our children, because we're frightened about stranger danger and all that, they're kept indoors, they're kept away from getting muddy knees and scratched hands, and we protect them, understandably, but in protecting them we're exposing them to much greater dangers because they won't have the resilience if and when they need it. If and when society might break down, we owe it to our children to give them survival skills of some kind.
That's certainly something else that I took away from, a thought that I took away from the book, even though it's not directly about that. It is a story about a refugee family, but in many ways it's a family story which is universal too. Families often have secrets. Most families have secrets of one kind or another. Yes. And this family has secrets too. They pop out from all over the place. We've talked a little bit about one of the mysteries in there, but there are other family members that come into the story, including a younger uncle who's almost
the same generation
as she is. Tell us a little bit about him.
Malik, I wanted him to play the role. It's difficult. Malik kind of introduced himself. He just popped in and I said, "Oh, hello, here you are, all right, you can come and join the party." He was there partly because I needed to have somebody who was going to be practical to help out with the daily things. And I wanted a contrast to her father because I wanted us to respect this man who isn't very well educated at all. He's dyslexic, actually. He's never learnt academic skills, but my goodness, he's practical, and he's very good with his hands. He's a good builder, electrician. He's worked out how to do so many good things, practical things, and I really wanted to have respect for him, and to show the great importance of people we sometimes take for granted.
Of all the characters in this story, he's the one that does have a faith, doesn't he?
Yes, he does.
We often think, or I say we, the way that the Middle East is reported, it's often assumed that it's all about religion, but actually here we have a family who's not terribly religious. They don't really observe, and certainly as they've come to Jordan, they're not going through the motions of observing anything religious. But he does, it's a strength for him, even though it's mentioned only briefly, it is a strength for him, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It absolutely is. And I think, one of the things about religion in the Middle East is that, of course, there are many people with a very, very strong personal faith, whether they're Jews in Israel or whether they're Muslims in various countries or Christians, who, of course, Christianity in the Middle East goes right back to the time of Christ. It's not an import from the West. And there are many people with very, very strong and deep faiths. But, of course, actually, the religion is also partly a badge of who you are. You know, you can be Jewish without being an Orthodox Jew. You can be Muslim without praying 5 times a day. You can call yourself a Christian without ever going to church. It's just a vague thing. You belong to that community. And in the Middle East, a lot of it's to do with the community you belong to.
Right.
And I just wanted to bring up that little contrast.
I want to talk a little bit about the women in the story. I don't know whether this is a fair thing to say, but it seemed to me that the women found it harder to accept, at least initially, their new relatives than the men did.
Oh yes, I think that's quite true. I mean, Aunt Zainab is a snob. She's a difficult woman, and she's suddenly appalled by all these scruffy, down-at-heel refugees coming and camping on her doorstep. Well, I mean, I can see quite a few people feeling like that, including probably myself. And you can't have everybody nice in a book. You've got to have somebody to kind of fight back against. And I needed to have a character that Safia has got to kind of react to in order to make her stronger. Because if she'd had a really lovey-dovey auntie kind of person, she wouldn't have found her inner strength.
I was going to say it did her some favours
she did
in a way. But there are 2 aunts, and both of them seem to find it more difficult than the uncles.
Yes, I think that's probably true, actually. I think the men, because they're not involved in the kind of daily struggle for living in a sense. I mean, Uncle Yasser goes out to work every day, but it's Aunt Zainab who has to kind of cope with this tent and the family living with them. And I think it's probably true. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's just that family. I don't know. I wouldn't really like to make changes.
I also want to talk a little bit about the notion of charity. That's something else that recurs, and the difficulty that some people have in accepting charity. The shopkeeper's wonderful, by the way, isn't he?
He's such a darling, isn't he? I know, he's adorable. Oh, I mean, we had a shopkeeper just like that in Beirut, down at the bottom of our flats. Oh, he was so nice. Can't remember his name now, but he was lovely, and he used to tickle my baby's tummy and say, he used to call him Buddha because he didn't have any hair when he was very small. He looked like a little Buddha, a little fat Buddha. And he was so gorgeous. So I always had sweeties and things which I had to take away from Angus afterwards. But he was rather like that shopkeeper.
And he makes it possible for this family to accept charity when they need it, but they don't want it, do they? At least.
No, they don't. And I mean, of course, they're proud people. They don't want to be given, they're not grasping at all. And I think you'll find that the vast majority of refugees hate being given charity. They might need it, but they hate it, as you would, as I would. I mean, we in this country we're having to get used to the idea of food banks, but there's an awful lot of people who go to food banks who really would rather not.
Is it quite hard to write a book like this with an element of hope? There's one point in the story between the 2 sisters, Safia and Saba, where Safia says to her sister, "You've got a future," and she feels that she has none. Is it quite hard to write a story about this and give a sense that the future is going to be okay?
It is, and I'm often blamed for having happy endings to my novels, but I feel that my readers are young, they're young teens or older children, and I feel very strongly that you shouldn't make them despair, and that you should make them feel that however awful a story has been, there is light at the end of the tunnel, even if it's quite a long way down the line. And that's an article of faith with me. I don't approve of depressing children with really sad ending. I mean, death, okay, you can make a death, in fact, into a good ending, but I think you must give your characters a future. So I always do, and I think that's really important. And actually, however dismal people's situations are, you'd be amazed how often their lives can turn around. I mean, I used to work with street kids. I knew a whole bunch of street children in Addis Ababa in the 1960s who were living on the edge in a gang of street kids, begging and stealing. And when I went back 30 years later, I tried to find them. I did find 2 of them. One of them had become a long-distance lorry driver, with a very good job, and the other one had become a tour guide operator and spoke French. I couldn't believe it. They took me out for lunch and they paid for it. You know, these were kids who begged from me when they were 10. And I was so thrilled to see that their lives had turned around. I wrote a novel about it, actually, called The Garbage King.
Yeah. Can I just ask you, I'm going to ask a difficult question. So I think from the discussion that we've had, it's really evident that this is an area of the world that you know well. You've lived in it, you've visited it, you do your research. There's been a lot of work recently through the work that I know you'll be familiar with, the CLP work, Reflecting Realities. And not out of that work, that's unfair, but at the same time, there is some voice given to the idea that you can't write other people's stories. What do you say to that?
I'm deeply conscious of this, Nikki. I'm terribly aware of it. And the first time I bumped my nose against this particular glass window was after I'd written a novel about my little brother who was disabled. I ran into very heavy weather where people had told me that I shouldn't have written it because it wasn't from the point of view of the disabled person. Well, I mean, I was his actual sister, which they perhaps didn't realise, but I didn't have a right to write about him. And I rejected that point of view because I thought I did have a right to write my own story. However, I'm deeply aware of the fact that I'm skating on thin ice, and I know that I'm expecting a tap on the shoulder any time somebody's saying, "Who do you think you are, Elizabeth Laird, pretending to be a Syrian child or an Ethiopian street boy or a whoever it is, Palestinian kid who wants to play football?" And all I can do is put my hands up and say, "Yeah, it's a fair cop." But I never write anything without talking to a lot of people in that situation and getting their permission and asking them for their advice. I mean, in the Jordanian refugee camps, I had an amazing time with those Syrian teachers, and we created stories together. And I said, "I'm going to write a novel. Is that okay with you guys?" They said, "Oh yeah, you must do it." And I said, "Well, tell me about your children that you're teaching. Just tell me what their main problems are." And they said, "Well, one of the things they're worried about most is their appearance, whether they're too fat, too thin, they've got big ears, whatever it is. Another is their friendships. They're very worried about their friendships. They're worried about bullying. They're scared of not passing their exams. They hate it when there's quarrels at home. They find their fathers too authoritative." I thought, hold on a minute, I know about this. They're kids. They're just kids. And okay, they may have lost everything. They may be living in a refugee camp. There may be bombers frequently passing overhead on their payloads about to drop them on Syria, as they were. All of that's happening, but they're worried about how they look. And I thought, I don't have to be too scared, actually, because really what I'm writing about is people.
Now, I know you do quite a lot of work with charities, and at one time you were involved, I think, with the Refugee Council, but now you have a Jordanian charity that you're involved with. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and also if there are ways that schools could get involved with the work that you do?
Oh, I'd love to tell you about that, Nikki. Well, if you look on the back page of both books, Welcome to Nowhere and A House Without Walls, you will find a letter from the author, who's me. And the letter talks about a very small charity. It's tiny. It's actually called Helping Refugees in Jordan. And it was set up by an amazing British woman to pull together all kinds of very small groups in Jordan who were doing things right on the ground with people at a very, very low basic level. And we've set up 2 schools, one up in near the Syrian border, and another one not far away from Amman in Jordan, where all the children are refugees, either from Iraq or Syria. And they would have had no other chance of an education at all. Those kids are traumatised, they're difficult. Some of them are wetting their beds. They may have lost a parent. And before you can even get them to sit still and listen, and they're 10 or 12 and they've never been to school, you have to take them gently through the process. So they do art and music and drama until they come to the point where they can sit down and listen and learn to read and write and do maths. And those schools are absolutely, they're very small. We've only got, a few hundred children, but they depend entirely on donations from the rest of the world. And my little input has been to try to publicise them. So schools in different parts of the country have done some wonderful things. Little bake sales. There was a marvellous schoolgirl in Scotland who climbed Ben Lomond, and she raised £119 for the charity.
Fantastic. Well done.
Well done. And in response, the head of the whole thing, Catherine Ashcroft, has said that if children would like to write letters or draw pictures to send to the schools in Jordan, they would be thrilled and delighted to have them, and they'd stick them up on the walls of their classrooms. So this is it could be a very small thing, but even a little bit of money raised in a school with the project, maybe a little readathon or whatever it is, will go directly to the schools in Jordan and directly to the kids to benefit them.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And they can find out about that from your website, which is
www.elizabethlaird.co.uk.
That's an easy one to
No
remember.
dots. Yes, that's all. Yes, exactly.
Elizabeth Laird.
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming to talk to us in the Reading Corner today, and thank you for keeping on writing these books that raise our awareness of what's going on in the world. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been a great privilege.
Thanks for listening to In the Reading Corner with Just Imagine. If you have enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more on the podcast section of our website, justimagine.co.uk, plus via iTunes or SoundCloud or your usual podcast provider. Don't forget to pass the pod and recommend this fantastic free resource to your friends and colleagues.